Well, welcome everybody to First Friday Club with Dr. David Roland. I'm Rowena Tuziak, Membership and Operations Manager at Writing New South Wales. Before we commence, I'd like to go over some technical aspects of today's chat. You'll be muted for the whole event to ensure the best sound quality. Let us know in the chat if you have any trouble hearing us or if you have any technical issues, and we'll do our best to help. When in doubt, the best possible solution is to exit the Zoom meeting and try to rejoin with the link in your email. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, we invite you to do so via the chat box. We'll take as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A at the end of the event. To see your speakers today, toggle your screen to speaker view in the top right-hand corner of the Zoom window. To see all the other attendees, toggle your view to gallery view, but we do recommend that you stay on speaker view for the entirety of the event, and you can turn off your video camera too if you'd like to. We are recording this event, so if you drop out or if you have to leave early, that's completely fine. You can watch it later on our website. Please note, in today's First Friday Club, we will be talking about issues related to trauma, so please be aware that you may find this. Some viewers may find this disturbing. All right, I'd like to commence with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, from whose lands this event is being broadcast today, and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands from which you are joining us today, and please feel free to make your own acknowledgement of country in the chat box if you would like to do that. Dr. David Roland is a narrative non-fiction writer and psychologist whose work is informed by his lived experience as well as his professional training. He is the author of The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Life Crises, The Confident Performer, How I Rescued My Brain, a Psychologist's Remarkable Recovery from Stroke and Trauma, and he joins us today for a very special First Friday Club where we will be having a timely discussion about mental health as well as books and writing. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Rowena. It's great to be here. And I'm coming from Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales.
Fabulous. We're very happy to have you. So, David, we're living through what is perhaps a uniquely challenging time for mental health. But before we dig into that, I'd like to start our conversation by discussing you and your professional background. Could you tell us what first led you to becoming a psychologist?
Oh, that's a fun story.
Great.
But I'll try and keep it short. But the short version is that my mother became a psychiatrist. She was born in England. My father was a pilot, Australian pilot in the Second World War, and then he went over to England to serve in Bomber Command. Fortunately, he didn't see frontline action. He was sent off to a training school to train other pilots and navigators. But he probably suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. And when he returned to Australia, to Sydney, which was his hometown, he became quite depressed, and he was admitted to a mental health hospital for a time. And they did whatever treatments was standard at that time. Nothing helped him, but he learned about psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud. He was a very intelligent and thoughtful person, even though he had left school early. And so he returned to London with the aim of seeking out a psychoanalyst called Edward Glover, who was a British psychoanalyst who'd written the book. And he started psychoanalysis in London, but eventually he gave that away and did his own self-analysis. But in the process, he met my mother, and they fell in love pretty quickly. And she was keen to come to Australia to have 4 children, which she did. At that time, she was a doctor. And when we were growing up, we were young children, she decided to study psychiatry because she realized that a lot of people came to the local GP surgery to talk about their emotional problems, as people called it in those days, but they would come with a sore finger or an ache as the excuse. So in those days, you didn't say you had a mental health problem. You had to present with a physical problem first. And she actually found people's stories really intriguing. So what that means is that around the dinner table, we talk psychology, human behavior. You know, we were one of those families that had pretty in-depth conversations
Wow.
around the dinner table. And on both sides of my parents, you know, delving into the inner life of being a human being was just a natural thing to do. So one day I was 16 and I went into my mother's study. I was looking through her psychiatry books and came across Sigmund Freud, who I had only heard about. And I started reading a concise history of his ideas. And I just went, wow, this is amazing. There's this whole inner life that I didn't, or we don't know about, and it could possibly explain why people do what they do. And I just found that intriguing.
Yeah. How fabulous your family dinner table experience. Much more interesting than a lot of people's, I think. I'd love to be a fly on the wall. And so that obviously led you to your interest in psychology. What made you then decide to be a writer? How did that transition happen?
I was doing my PhD in clinical psychology. I always wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And I was advised that if you're going to do a PhD, you really had to choose something you were passionate about, because the hardest aspect of a PhD is just the persistence. You know, it's a real slog. And you really have to feel passionate about what you're doing. And I was also a musician, and I'd played semi-professionally. And I thought if I could combine music and psychology, my two major passions, that would probably do it. And just purely by chance, I decided to do my postgrad at the University of Wollongong. And the conservatorium director came to the psych department and said, look, we've got all these nervous students when they perform. And of course, they call it stage fright. And I thought, that's it. I'm a psychologist and a musician, but maybe what I can offer is a psychologist's view, because there were a lot of standard things that psychologists did for anxiety, and I could apply that to performance. So I did that research, and the first book I wrote, The Confident Performer, is a self-help book. And it was always intended primarily for musicians, so there's no academic language in there. In fact, in those days, and I had no notion of how to get published, I just rang up a few publication houses in Sydney, and I remember speaking to the commissioning editor for one of the major publication houses. You just got put straight through to the editor. Oh, and he said, oh yeah, it's a great idea, but I want you to generalize it to all types of anxiety, like exam anxiety. And I said, no, I really want it to be for performers. So I eventually found a smaller press that devoted to performers, and that was Currency Press. But then later on, when I had my stroke and also suffered post-traumatic stress disorder from my work, this is 20 years after that, I got through that, and I thought it would be really useful to write about this to help others, because I found other people's stories really helpful in those very dark times. And they could be stories that were written stories, they could be told stories, or they could be movies, you know, based on real life events. And they created a lot of hope for me and kept me sustained. So my way of giving back was to write something. And I realized that I wasn't a good narrative writer. I'd been a good professional writer, but I did a lot of online courses and got some mentoring through our local writers center and developed my narrative writing skills. And in doing that, I realized how much I love this creative side of putting, you know, words on a page and losing that professional, objective, third person voice, which I'd had to use in my forensic and clinical work, and putting myself on the page, as exposing as that was.
Yeah. Well, I would like to talk in more detail about that particular book. So in How I Rescued My Brain, A Psychologist's Remarkable Journey from Stroke and Trauma, recovery from stroke and trauma, you chronicle your journey to recovery, both your cognitive journey as well as your path to emotional health and well-being. Can you tell us a little bit about your stroke and its impact, and also what it was like to write about that?
The stroke was, what they call a walk and talk stroke. So I could walk and I could talk, although my wife said I talked in this very dreamy voice, like it wasn't my usual voice. I just woke up one morning and I was just walking around the house in an aimless kind of way. And she realized something was really wrong and rushed me to the hospital. And they misdiagnosed it. They just, I don't know what they thought it was, but they didn't pick up there was a stroke. So I missed some important, those drug busting treatment that you're supposed to get within the first 6 hours. So in the end, the stroke affected my vision, and it affected my memory, particularly my short-term memory, and my memory for a lot of acquired knowledge, like the names of people, the names of books, the names of actors. You would tell a story. I could remember the movie, but I couldn't remember any of the names of the people in the story. And the other thing that the other big outcome, the lasting outcome, and I would say that I would identify as having an invisible disability. I can do all the physical things that, I used to be able to do, and in some cases better. But the invisible disability is mental fatigue, which is a common occurrence with any type of brain injury. It means that I can't concentrate for as long as I would have before. And it also means that I can get sensory overload, particularly from a lot of sounds around, extraneous sounds. So I work much better in a quieter environment, or an environment where I can control the sensory input.
Yeah, and that must have made it incredibly challenging, not only to sort of recover and feel good within your soul, but also, to then put it down on paper, particularly if you fatigue easily. I'm interested in that process of writing about it, and also, given the personal disclosure nature of it, were there challenges around that, and how did you navigate that?
Well, once again, I came at it from the point of view of how can I help others, because there'd been amazing people. And I tear up every time I think about some of the people that helped me through my really dark years. But I thought what really helped was other people with lived experience who just told me straight up how it was for them, and people that had got through dark times, and just hearing their stories, even if their occurrence was a different one from mine. It just cultivated that sense of hope, and that sense that if I just keep putting one foot in front of the other, try new things. I learned after a while that you just have to try every new thing and see if it makes a difference. If it doesn't make a difference, you move on to something else. And it's the accumulation of trying all those new things and putting them together that builds a recovery. And so I was motivated to just tell it how it really was. So, I experienced really strong suicidal thoughts at times.
Wow.
And I thought, well, I shouldn't gloss over that, because there are other people that are experiencing this. And just by naming it and sharing it, here is someone like me, somebody who's a bit of an overachiever and, had the perfect life before everything fell apart. And if they can feel suicidal, well, if I feel that way, I must be just another fellow human being. So, my first mentor, Alan Close, said, the bits that people really want to read is the bits that you squirm when you write.
Yeah, right.
So from a writer's perspective, I was really encouraged by what he said. So rather than doing sort of an anodized, sort of superfluous or superficial version, I thought I have to put in the bits where I squirm. And fortunately, I'd kept a diary through a lot of those years, and I kept that diary for therapeutic reasons, because writing down what you're experiencing is a way of taking control over emotions, being able to name them, being able to put them into a narrative so you can start to make sense. And also it's a way of flicking back where you can see, oh, I've made progress.
Right.
Because when your progress is so slow and it's incremental and you're in it, it can feel like you're not making progress. And that's why we often need other people that we trust who can see what we're doing to say, look, you're actually looking better, or you couldn't do that a few months before. So the journal gave me a lot of material to go back. And when I went back over some of those really difficult periods, and I'm talking about writing now when I was out of that period, I didn't enjoy it at all, because I had to go back and feel what I felt and think what I thought at that time, and, re-experience some of those horrible times to be able to write about them. So people say that, writing about your life story when it's been traumatic must be cathartic. And I've heard other writers similarly say, no, it's not cathartic, it's awful.
Yeah, right.
It can be really awful, because you actually would rather you've moved on and you'd rather not revisit those times. So I was motivated, in an altruistic way, I think, to try and put on the page what did feel very exposing, because I just thought, well, that's going to be the most useful for other people.
Thanks, David. And I might just ask that someone from our team is going to add to the chat box the number for Lifeline. As I mentioned, we are talking about issues related to trauma, and I want to make sure everyone's looking after themselves and has support. David, that experience, your personal experience, as well as your work, your psychology background, has informed your writing of The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Life Crises, in which you take us through the experiences of 11 people experiencing truly horrific trauma from domestic violence and bigotry and sudden loss of family. I imagine that psychologists already feel this great weight of responsibility for clients experiencing trauma, but as a writer sharing those personal accounts, that must have been quite a daunting prospect. Was it?
Actually, I actually loved writing this book much more than the memoir, because these were people that had been through major life upheavals and had actually come through the other side as better people. And when I say better people, I don't mean that they would necessarily wish to go through all of that again if they had the choice to do it or not. In some cases, they said, yeah, that was one of the best things that happened to me. But people had grown in really positive ways, or in ways in which they'd liked. And I'd found the same thing myself. So that's what turned me on to this topic of post-traumatic growth. That trauma, and I'm using trauma in a broad sense here. So there's the clinical sense of trauma where we feel threatened, our life is threatened, or we witness somebody else's life being threatened, or we hear very traumatic stories and we experience vicarious trauma. That's certainly, a real and one aspect of trauma. But we can also say trauma in the narrative sense, where our life story, the life story that we've created for ourselves, is violently disrupted. So you can imagine someone who's going along fine, and then suddenly they have a car accident and they're now a paraplegic, and maybe they were going to be a sports person, or a person that really needed their legs and mobility to do what they needed to do. And Janine Shepard, who was an Australian Olympic skier who's now a friend of mine, is a classic example of that. She was on a training ride, she was hit by a car, and she was off to the Winter Olympics. And now, she's had to completely change her career and became an aviator and a motivational speaker and writer. So when our life story is violently disrupted, that's a form of trauma. And another form of trauma is moral injury. Moral injury is where, we see people doing things that just really violently are against our ethics, or we've done something that violates our sense of ethics. And returned soldiers can experience this as well, whereas in the battle zone, they might do things that later on they think, oh, that was horrible. I don't know how I could have done that. So, first responders can experience moral injury. And I really feel for our frontline health workers at the moment, because they can see people who, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but who are doing things that in a sense bring on the illness or the difficult health crisis that they're in. I can't remember your question now.
Oh,
But
no, well, my question was about the sort of daunting experience of writing other people's stories. And I guess I have an add-on question to that as well, which is what are some of the sort of ethical considerations when you're telling other people's stories, and how, how do you navigate that?
yeah, that's a great question. And that applied to the memoir as well. In The Power of Suffering, because there's a lot of stories there. There's not just my story, as in the memoir, and a few people that were involved in my life story. So what I did was, first of all, seek out people. I had a range of people, a range of type of traumas, life upheavals or traumas that I had in mind. And I sought out people that, fitted into the different slots that I had in mind. Like I wanted a refugee story, for example. And I could approach those people and say, look, this is what I have in mind. I'd like to tell your story. And what I will do is that, it involves some interviews or spending some time with them. I will write up the interviews, which I recorded with their permission, and I'll give you a transcript of that interview, and then my editor transcript, what I actually want to put in the book, or the first major draft. And I want you to check, is there anything in here you really don't want me to put in? Is there anything in here that's incorrect or that you'd like to reword, as long as it's still authentic to the story? So that gave all the storytellers editorial safety. Because when we're dealing with trauma, any trauma-informed practice, the first rule is to create a sense of safety. And that takes a bit of skill and sensitivity. So I spend a lot of time creating a sense of safety with the people that I was working with. And some people weren't ready to be interviewed or tell their story because it was still too raw for them. So these were people for whom they well and truly had got through it, and could talk about the past.
Yeah, right. We touched on this briefly, but there seems to be a huge appetite among readers for clinical stories. For example, works like Oliver Sacks' The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and many others. What's behind that appetite, do you think?
Well, I'm sort of making an educated guess here, but I think we're just becoming more appraised of our inner world, particularly our mental health world. So this idea that we do have this mental side to us, which is just as big and just as real as the physical side of us. So that growing awareness around mental health. I think another huge breakthrough has been neuroscience. And neuroscience is one of my favorite topics. So neuroscience, what it's done is opened up, what's happening inside our brain. So we can look at what's happening in our brain. We haven't been able to do that before. I mean, it's still rough. It's still rough. Like we can't look at what's happening to an individual neuron in the brain, but we can look at, a clump of neurons through functional MRI and other types of scanning techniques. So we can ask somebody to imagine something in an MRI machine, and then we can see, from the data that comes up, how that's affecting their brain activity. So we've got a window into the brain, and certainly the brain is central to the mind. And so now we've got this way of looking at things into what used to be a black box. So that, I think that's part of, Norman Doidge's book about the brain, I think was a real eye-opener in that sense.
Well, I was going to ask you if you have any favourite books or books that have sort of inspired your writing, or book recommendations on a related topic. I know you've talked about The Body Keeps the Score once before. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, I think Norman Doidge's writing, because, he's popularizing writings about the brain and behavior and recovery. I met Norman at the Sydney Writers' Festival the year I was, touring my memoir. And so I think he writes really clearly about that. Dan Siegel's Mindsight was an eye-opening book for me because it talked about mindfulness meditation, how it changed the brain function. That was a really critical book for me because I realized that I could do practices to heal my brain by changing the focus of my attention. Mm-hmm. This is a very powerful principle. By simply changing the focus of your attention, you know, if your attention is like a spotlight, where do I put that spotlight? And I do it over and over again, and it'll strengthen some neural pathways in the brain, which then has a practical or pragmatic effect. So when we're, you know, to reduce reactivity, when you've been traumatized, you're constantly being triggered, your threat system's being triggered, and you're hypersensitive. That's why it can be difficult to be around people who are traumatized, because they're just so jumpy. But through mindfulness meditation, you strengthen a pathway between the frontal cortex and the amygdala, which is the threat system, which gives you a bit of space to think before you act. So it creates this space, and that space seems to get bigger and bigger the more you practice or strengthen this neural pathway. And that's what I experienced. So Mindsight was one of those books. Right. And I think, you know, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Okay. You know, just this idea of, you know, his book is so relevant for our time because, you know, he was talking about this being in the concentration camps, never knowing if there was going to be a release, never knowing if they were ever going to get out. Was there ever going to be an end date? And, you know, they had to find ways to cultivate hope and a mental life, because, you know, physical life was so emaciated.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Some really powerful recommendations and advice there. To our audience, just a little reminder to add your questions to the chat box for our Q&A later on in the session. David, there's no denying that we are currently experiencing this really challenging time for mental health. Specifically with writers, some writers have found that time spent in lockdown can be incredibly productive, lucky them. But I think a more common feeling is this sort of emotional malaise, that kind of met feeling that's far more common. So how do these kinds of events like the pandemic or similar, how do they kind of impact our creativity?
I think we do need to recognize there's individual differences. Mm-hmm. So I'll talk about myself first to give a context. I you know, my last book, The Power of Suffering, pub date was the 1st of March, which of course is when we went into lockdown. So I had a couple of bookshop events, and that was when this weird thing called social distancing was coming in. So, you know, the audience was all separated and everyone wasn't sure whether they should touch you or hug you. So with the, you know, those who are in the audience who are book writers or write long form know that there's a gestation period, you know, where you're forming your idea, and it can feel like nothing much is happening. Yeah. You know, it's a difficult period, isn't it, between books, and it feels like nothing much is happening, that germination period. But then a few things start to come together, and, you know, something, a word or a phrase or a title suddenly clicks, and you think that's it. So I was expecting to have a year of, you know, publicity events, meeting the audience after 3 years of working on that project, which involved a lot of travel and interviews and research, and then nothing. So, you know, all the publicity got cancelled, and the touring I was expecting got cancelled. So it came at the wrong time for me. But if you're a writer who's, you know, in that gestation period and has formed their idea, and then the lockdown comes, well, it's almost perfect. Yeah. Because you need to lock yourself away. You don't want a lot of, you know, distractions. And so it works really well for you. So I envy those that, you know, the timing was right in that sense. So I've come across some writers for whom the lockdown has been great because financially they're secure, and they're at that point, you know, creatively, where they were ready to really, you know, get into that that zone of just writing day to day. But I think for a majority of writers, and it's certainly true for me, this sense of languishing, being in between, or this luminous state, or that state, Viktor Frankl talks about, where we don't know when the end date's coming. You can't plan ahead because things keep getting cancelled, or the goalposts getting changed all the time. So you get into a state of learned helplessness, where it feels like, nothing you do makes a difference. So I think for a lot of writers, it's a difficult period of lack of motivation, sort of foggy-headedness, finding it hard to get a focus. And then, of course, if you've got young children at home, it's almost impossible. Although I know a young children's writer for whom it's actually worked well.
Okay, I can imagine it would be chaos, but to have children and as well as the stress of dealing with financial insecurity and all of that sort of stuff. We might dig into that a bit in more detail later. For those people who are kind of experiencing that languishing feeling, particularly writers, how can they get their creative spark back? What can they do to protect themselves emotionally, but also to kind of get their creativity flowing again?
I think one of the things to realize is where does that sense of creativity come from? What's the mindset or the physiological state in which you feel most creative? And this is true in life, not just for writing or other creative pursuits, is that we feel our sense of creativity comes best when we feel safe, when we feel soothed, when we don't feel under threat, and where we've got the physical resources to be able to do it. So I think the first answer to that question is do a lot of soothing practices, things that help you to feel comforted and safe. Physiologically speaking, why we feel this sort of in-between state of languishing is because our physiology is set up for us to be active or to respond to an immediate threat, deal with that threat, and then calm down again. What's happened with this current situation is the threat keeps arising. It never quite goes away. And so it keeps churning, a neural hormonal response to activate and then stop, activate, then stop. And it's really, it's actually a very unhealthy state to be in. So what it's the difference is between we're good at running a sprint, but not so good at a marathon. That's the neurology. Right. So we need to really respect our neurology and find out ways to bring it back into that balanced, soothing state. We've got three main motivation systems: the drive system, which is goal-oriented, of just getting ahead, getting the resources that we need; the threat system, which is keeping us safe from threats, perceived threats or real threats; and then there's the rest and digest, or rest and recovery system. And that's the system we need to cultivate. And for me, one of those ways of doing that is spending more time in nature. And nature, could be your garden or in the gardening, or it could be sitting in a park. It's best to exercise where there's green or there's blue or both. We're much more soothed when we're exercising in an outdoor environment like that than, say, in a gym. But even if you have, nature sounds playing, or diffusing essential oils that come from, I've been reading a lot about forest bathing. It's my new passion. And you can diffuse essential oils that come from trees. There's a lot of health benefits for being in nature that are physiological as well as emotional. So people know those things that help to soothe them, whether it's having long hot baths, whether it's connecting with people, as best you can in a lockdown situation. Think about what it's like when you want to soothe a loved one, whether it's a child or it's an adult. What do you do? And think of yourself, how would you like to be soothed?
Yeah, fabulous. Thanks, David. Those responses may feed into my next question. aside from the pandemic, as writers, generally we kind of experience rejection. It's part of the process, as is, you know, struggling with perfectionism and imposter syndrome and self-doubt and all of that. Have you've experienced that yourself as a writer? I can see you nodding there, David. So this year, Writing New South Wales commissioned some very beautiful essays on the theme of resilience. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, you know, how we as writers can be resilient in confronting that sort of rejection and self-doubt.
I think, you know, we do all the things that would create resilience anyway, which is, you know, having good social support, good physical health, that would apply to everyone. Now, we know that part of the nature of being in the writing business is rejection. Just as, you know, a performance artist knows that getting on stage and experiencing performance anxiety is actually a normal part of the process. So, you know, I've dealt with a lot of professional musicians, and they know that it's just part of what they do. So they find their ways of dealing with that. So we just need to see it as something that's not unexpected or to be expected. It's okay to feel rejection, to feel hurt, maybe to feel angry, maybe to feel misunderstood, and to soothe, you know, like to retire hurt, you know, pick up your bat and go home for a while. It's okay to feel that way. And it's also good to have trusted others who will hear how you feel about that. You know, we need to have fellow writers, for example, who understand the writing process, or others that would understand, you know, that rejection process. You know, like I said, I've got a daughter who's in the acting space, and most of the time they don't get the part that they're auditioning for. You know, it's only a small number. And so I think it's okay to retire hurt, then tell how you feel to trusted others, and then see if there's anything you can learn from it. So, you know, with my last book, you know, we went back to my previous publisher, and they said, oh yes, we'd like to publish this book, but they had some reservations, and I had some reservations about the proposal. I wanted to rework it. I reworked it into what I thought was a much stronger proposal, and then they changed their mind. And you know, my agent said, look, publishers make decisions that aren't always based on the quality of the work. You know, it's how it might fit in with their list at that time and who the personnel are at that time. My former editor had left, so I didn't have her to champion me. But anyway, we put it around to a few other publishers, and there was, you know, we got an eager response. So what can you learn? Maybe there's something about your proposal, or the timing isn't right. Maybe you need to shelve that idea and work on another idea. You know, what can you learn from that? And then talk to other people that you trust.
There's some really great suggestions there. Thank you, David. And you know, you're right about talking to other writers. You know, writing community is such an important part of being a writer. So I have a question about writing about traumatic experiences. So traumatic experience can provide a really rich, you know, rich writing material, which sometimes can be cathartic, as we talked about, but it can also, you know, on occasion reactivate that trauma. Also, for the writer to make that traumatic experience something meaningful for a reader, it needs to perhaps be more than just a therapeutic exercise. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts around that.
Yes, we can't treat our writing like therapy. You know, as storytellers, we have to fashion a story. And we know that when we fashion a story, it's an edited version of real life. And it's edited because, you know, if you were reading through the minutiae of every person's trauma, it'd get really boring and very long. Yeah. So we have to edit it, and we have to keep in mind, what's the question we're answering or addressing in writing this story? What's the purpose? So that's the first. We need to approach it as a writer, just thinking about it as a story. With writing trauma, it is very touchy, and I think for the writer, they do need to have processed trauma themselves and be able to soothe themselves or feel safe, if it's starting to trigger things. So I can give you an example. In my memoir, How I Rescued My Brain, I worked in the prison system early in my career, and I was there when Anita Cobby was murdered, and her killers were brought into the prison, and I had first-hand dealings with them. I found that really difficult. It was really awful because I was experiencing moral injury, I suppose. I abhorred what they'd done, or what was rumored that they had done. They were on remand at that time. But I couldn't write about that experience in the memoir. It was just too triggering for me. I couldn't even read anything about her story until many years later. And when I was writing The Power of Suffering, and I was in Sydney after doing one of my research interviews, I'd had it in mind to go and visit her gravesite as a form of closure for myself. And I ended up writing about that experience in The Power of Suffering. But I felt much safer then. I was able to, I felt I could keep safe. And it was a cathartic experience for me to go and visit her site and to write about that particular episode, just as a small part of the bigger theme of that book. So I think, as writers, we do need to know how to keep safe, and we do need to approach it as a storyteller.
Yeah.
But we do need to enter the trauma experience, otherwise it's not real for the reader.
So proceed with caution, but perhaps, yeah. Look, I guess I should point out that you are actually going to be teaching a course for us on writing your new story after trauma. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what participants can expect from that course.
Well, first of all, safety is number one. So I spend a bit of time talking about how people can keep safe and the group can keep safe. And people don't need to talk about their trauma at all, any of the details of their trauma. So it's about, we use the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is the template for how we find our new story. And, we do paired exercises where I take people through the different stages of the hero's journey, both with my psychologist hat on, but also the writing hat on. So one of the ways in which we grow from life disruptions, whether we want to call it trauma or a life upheaval or, great loss, is we need to find new meaning and new sort of coherence in our story, because the old story is gone and we can't resurrect that old story. So we need to find acceptance first that that's the case. This is how it is now. And I need to learn new things. I need to open up to new people. I need to rethink who I am. And that's that could be a long period of time to do that. And it can be a distressing period of time to do that. But ultimately, we can come through that and become a new person. And this new person is often a person we like better. And so I'm helping people, in a sense, find the new person through writing a new story.
Great, thank you, David. I'm aware that we've got a whole lot of questions building up, so it's probably time to progress to the Q&A. I do want to ask you one very quick question, though. Do you have any plans to write about the pandemic?
It still feels too new to me. But interestingly, just putting that idea in mind that when something comes along, it disrupts our life story. And so we need to refocus. So first step of refocusing is working out, what do I have control over and what don't I have control over? And then opening up to new possibilities. That's one of the post-traumatic growth domains, is opening to new possibilities. When one door opens, another door opens, but only if you're prepared to see the new door opening. And for me, one of the things that's happened is that a local walking group formed, and we've been exploring our neighboring forests because we've had to stay in our local area. And I've started to become really interested in forest bathing and being in nature. whether that's in a forest or it's another natural setting. And I've been leading walks, and we recently, when we just came out of lockdown briefly, we managed to get away for a weekend of camping in our local area, and we did a forest bathing weekend. And if I'm going to write about the pandemic, it's going to be about how we deal with life disruptions, because I foresee we've got more ahead of us. Unfortunately, with climate change, I think it's inevitable. So this is a practice run, really, is how I'm seeing it. So how do we deal with life disruptions?
And I think there'd probably be a very big market for that. So I hope you do write it, and I hope we get to read it. We'll move on to the questions from our audience now, David. Quite a few questions here. Let me see. Let's start with this one, because it should be a swift answer, I think. Cynthia is asking, what exactly is a clinical psychologist as opposed to other forms of psychology?
Okay, well, clinical psychology is dealing with people with mental illness and helping them recover. So there's organizational psychologists that deal more with industry and organizations and how well they function. There's social psychologists who deal more with, in a more sociology sense. There's neuropsychologists that deal more with, how the brain works. There's counseling psychologists that just do straight psychotherapy.
So fabulous, and more and more and more. So there's lots of places you can discover more, Cynthia. Nigel has a question. He says, is trauma generally the result of an acute event, or can it be the result of long-term ongoing trauma for long-term difficulty? For example, would a generally tough childhood be called trauma?
Yes, and what we want to be careful of is that we don't compare our trauma with somebody else's trauma. So someone might have a difficult childhood that everyone says, oh yeah, you had a difficult childhood, and that person seems to have gotten through that okay, become more resilient, and seems to be flourishing, where I might have had a difficult childhood and I'm not flourishing. So there's a whole lot of individual differences that can come into play. But acute trauma could be, like a first responder coming across some horrific accident. So one of the stories in my book is of a paramedic chaplain who came across a horrific road accident, and that actually he was a nurse, and that motivated him actually to become a chaplain for paramedics. So we can have an acute trauma, but ongoing trauma is actually the worst, generally, the more difficult to navigate. So child sexual abuse or any form of chronic neglect is more difficult to negotiate, and it has that accumulative effect. Yeah,
right. This is perhaps this, I'm not sure if you call this acute or not, but this is a question in regards to war. Do you subscribe to the theory that it takes about 10 years for stories to emerge after massive trauma has happened with the Vietnam War and World War II? It's a question from Maria.
Yeah, I can't comment specifically on war stories. There is a book that came out in America last year as well on post-traumatic growth, and it's all veteran stories. So one of the psychologists who's the pioneer in the research of post-traumatic growth, he co-wrote this book, but it's veterans talking about their war stories. And I don't know, I haven't been able to read that or get my hands on that book yet, but I don't know if that's Vietnam veterans or more recent veterans. Once again, it's individual differences. So it's got a lot to do with how much social support you have as a returned soldier. And also we know that for Vietnam veterans, the social support they got when they came back was awful, or it was more than awful. So that actually made it much more difficult for them to reintegrate. So now there is better support for returned soldiers. There's recognition that there's post-traumatic stress disorder. Prior to Vietnam War, that wasn't recognized at all, or not as a formal diagnosis, and not as something that needed treatment.
I've got a really interesting question here from Cheryl. Cheryl's asking, did people, when you were interviewing people for your work, The Power of Suffering, did people remain consistent in their reaction to your transcript of interviews, she said, or did the trauma affect them differently on different days? So were they unable to give you permission to print their stories? Let me read that back. Did people remain consistent in their reaction to your transcript of interviews, or did the trauma affect them differently on different days so they were unable to give you permission to print their stories? So
I think I understand the question. They were consistent. So because I was interviewing people, well past the trauma experiences, and I'm using trauma again in that broader sense, they had processed the trauma or the life upheaval. So of course it was consistent. So really what I was checking with their transcripts is that I hadn't got anything wrong, or they might just want to rephrase something, just because obviously when you're doing an interview like I'm doing now, if I listen back to this recording, I'll say, oh no, I should have said this, or I wish I'd said it this way.
We all do it. So I have another World War II veteran-related question. This one's from Lynn. Lynn is writing a memoir as the daughter of a World War II veteran, and she is particularly interested in intergenerational trauma. And she wants to know if you've worked with any clients on this, and can you recommend any papers or books on the subject?
I haven't worked with intergenerational trauma. There are studies on obviously there's studies on intergenerational trauma, and interestingly there's studies on intergenerational trauma and post-traumatic growth. But if you go to Google Scholar and just research that topic, you'll find heaps of stuff. Great.
That's something for you to do after this session, Lynn. This is a question from, this is a comment and a question from Judy. During the first lockdown in Victoria, Judy couldn't string two words together. Her brain was definitely in a fog. Now that spring is here and lockdowns are second nature, it's interesting to see that her muse has returned. Oh, lucky Judy. And she's able to write humorously again. Were you able to find the funny side again, or does the darker side remain, especially on cold winter days? I think that was probably a question for everyone in the room, I suspect. But do you have a response to that, David?
Is there a question there?
Well, I think she wants I think this is probably a question for all of the participants in the Zoom room. And actually, you might want to pop your comments and responses to Judy there. She's curious to know, are you stuck in the gloom, or are you able to find the funny side again? And hopefully Judy might be able to put a few wisecracks in the chat box for us, and we can all have a laugh, because I think it's sorely needed. I think we're very much...
I think there is a worthwhile comment here, I was looking at some findings from the Lancet COVID-19 Commission Mental Health Task Force, and that report's about to come out, reviewing, the mental health response to the pandemic. And really the main comment I think that's relevant here is, in the initial stage of the pandemic and lockdowns, we all experienced a huge amount of uncertainty. Our threat systems were really triggered because we weren't sure where the threat was coming from and what we could do that was safe and what wasn't safe. And we were getting that emergency response, which humans are good at dealing with, actually, but it was causing a lot of distress. What's happened now is that we understand the threats better, and everybody's developed new routines, because we need routines in our daily life for lots of reasons. But now that our worlds have shrunk in a physical sense, we've developed routines that fit within that smaller world, as well as online routines like this. What we're doing today just feels absolutely normal now, but it wouldn't have 2 years ago.
Absolutely.
So we've developed new routines. And once we develop new routines and we feel that sense of safety that I was talking about that sits beneath creativity, that's when I think the muse can come back. And when, from a germination point of view, you're ready to have new ideas or flesh them out.
Yeah, great. This is another question. This one's from Fernanda. She's very interested in how culture shapes the way we deal with trauma, and is asking if in your work, have you come across any ways in which different cultural contexts may facilitate or jeopardize pathways to recovery? Oh, that's an interesting one. Have you done much work across cultures?
I wouldn't say I've done a lot. I'll make two comments. One is that certainly cultural differences do make a difference. So, for example, in my refugee story, in The Power of Suffering, it's an African family from Chad who now live in Queensland. And I interviewed, my main subject was Prudence, the daughter, who's now a lawyer. But I was sitting with the whole family. But she told me later that, you know, African families don't deal with mental health very well. It's not something that they talk about or traditionally talk about. So she needed to, her parents are very supportive, and progressive, but she was saying, culturally speaking, you know, mental health is a new subject area for, she said African, so I don't know how broad that is. And then there was a second point, which I've forgotten.
Jeopardizing or facilitating pathways to
recovery. Yeah, just that with the post-traumatic growth research, this was the second point, it has been found that post-traumatic growth occurs across all cultures. Mm-hmm. And we do know that Asian cultures tend to be more community-minded, more we-minded, and, you know, Western cultures like us tend to be more I-minded, you know, more, you know, individual freedom. And so from a point of view of post-traumatic growth, it's better to have a more of a we focus, a sense of community, rather than just an I focus.
And I think we're all desperate for community right now, and it's great that we're starting to have, you know, open up again and connect with people, and of course still meet with these online communities as well. David, I've got one final question. This is from Lisa. Lisa freezes every time she has positive outcomes from writing. For example, having a book published, receiving great feedback, and recently she received an offer of residency. Do you have any suggestions regarding how to overcome this?
Well, the psychologist in me would want to find out more
sure.
about what's going on.
Yeah.
Obviously, I would say there's some history there that might trigger that freeze response. If she does literally mean it feels like she freezes, you know, there's the fight, flight, freeze response. And the freeze response in an evolutionary sense is when we play dead. You know, we're so overwhelmed that we play dead. You know, the predator is much bigger than us. We can't flee it, we can't fight it. And so we flop and we pretend to be dead. That's the freeze response. And women get that response more than males. So it's just a common finding. So that's a general comment, but other than that, I can't think of what might be causing that, other than if you think about it as performance anxiety, in which case my book, The Confident Performer, would be relevant. You know, just think about it in terms of stage fright or performance anxiety, and maybe do a bit of reading up on those topics and how people move through that.
Great. Thank you, David. That's good advice. All right. Well, thanks to our audience for joining us. If anything has come up for you today and you need someone to talk to or support, the number for Lifeline is 131114. That's 131114. And we'll be sharing that in the chat box along with a couple of other organisations that can provide support. I'd like to thank Dr. David Roland for generously taking the time to chat with us today. Thank you, David.
Thank you. You've been a great audience, even though I can't see you. I can feel you.
They have. These virtual communities are super important as well, and we do intend to continue them. But this is our last First Friday event of the year, but instead I would like to invite you along to our Boundless Festival taking place online at the end of the month. Boundless is Australia's leading festival of Indigenous and culturally diverse Australian writers, and will be presented online from the 30th of October to the 1st of November, so please don't miss it. We hope to see you there, and thank you everyone for joining us today for First Friday Club. See you later.
Bye everyone.
Farewell.